Thank you, Dr. Crandall. I don't profess to be an expert of insects because I'm not. So, I've heard that if you're going to start a lecture and you're going to start with a joke, it should either be funny or dirty. So I've prepared two. So we'll just see how far it goes. Yeah. So, okay, there's a man standing on the Brooklyn Bridge, right? And he's going to jump. He's going to end his life. And another man walks up to him and tries to talk him down and tries to build on common beliefs. Maybe he's an old missionary or BRTing or something, and says, so are you Christian? And he said, yeah, I am Christian. So he says, well, that's great. So am I. Are you an Orthodox, a Catholic, a Mormon, a Protestant? And the guy says, well, I'm a Protestant. And the other man says, yes, great. So am I. And he says, what kind of Protestant are you? Are you an Anglican? Are you a Baptist? Are you a Presbyterian? Are you a Methodist? And Pentecostal? And the man says, I'm a Pentecostal. The other guy says, great, so am I. So he feels like he's building on these common beliefs. And so then he gets more excited and he says, so are you initial evidence or third wave Pentecostal? And the guy says, initial evidence, of course. So he says, yes, me too. And he says, what kind of initial evidence are you? Are you an AOG, a CRC, a COC, a CCC, or an AOG? And the man got really excited and said, an AOG, of course. He's like, great, so am I. So he says, next question, are you premillennial, postmillennial, or amillennial? And the man says, well, I'm amillennial. The other man pushes him off the bridge and says, die, heretic. And he plunges to his death. Okay, he's got a couple of laughs on that. So unlike most jokes to start talks, this one actually has something to do with what I'm going to talk about. After talking to Ashley and agreeing to speak, I was babysitting upstairs. We live in a basement apartment and babysitting for the family upstairs. And they have a young boy named Adam who just turned 8. And he, for his 8th birthday, got a label maker, you know, those plastic ones with the tape. And in about 3 days, he'd gone through 2 full rolls of labeling tape, labeling everything. Stairs, sisters, the cat, I think, got one. And so I was sitting there babysitting, watching, I don't know, Harry Potter or something with his sisters. And he would walk by and give us a label and go back and make another one and put them on our forehead. And by the end of the night, I had a label that said, Tyler is a cool coyote. And I really don't know what that means. But he really enjoyed labeling things. And it kind of got me thinking about why or where this idea of labeling things comes from. Where's this obsession? Like, why is it satisfying for Adam to put labels and names on things? So this also relates to kind of what I'm going to talk about. There's another boy I'm going to talk about. His name is Carlos, and he was born in 1707 in Sweden. And I think he'll help us answer this question that we're going to talk about. He was the son of a Lutheran pastor who was also an avid gardener. He loved plants and he loved the Bible. So Carlos's dad kind of pressured him into the priesthood, wanted him to become a pastor and follow in his footsteps. But actually he inherited his other passion, which was a passion for plants. And he really liked knowing the names of plants and how and when they grew and how to help them grow. He enrolled in school to study medicine, but always got sidetracked looking at the plants in the gardens and didn't really focus on studying medicine very, very well. That continued. I wonder where that went. Okay. So he wrote a paper which is one of the most influential papers in modern science, arguably. Probably Darwin's Origin of Species is more influential, but this one is, the man is Carlos Linnaeus, okay? Ready, go. Okay, and his paper was called Systema Naturae, or however you pronounce that in Latin. This paper introduced, and through later revisions, solidified his theory of taxonomy, how to label and name things. Most of us are familiar with the term binomial nomenclature. When you're reading something and you see the two words in Latin, first one capitalized, usually in italics. That's the genus species name of whatever you're reading about. We're pretty familiar with that, but I just want to go over it just briefly. So basically, this is what Linnaeus came up with. Everything is broken down into ever increasingly specific names of things. So, for example, us. We are in the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordate, the class Mammalia, the order Primate, family Hominid, genus Homo, species Sapien. That's why we're called Homo sapiens. Okay? The most specific first and last name that you give things. But it's important to point out how this idea has really impacted the way that everyone looks at society, how we put names and labels on almost everything. Not just people, but insects, plants, anything in the living world we put names on. For example, this. Okay, who knows what this is? Dr. Clark. Other than Dr. Clark. But what would you call this thing? Maybe an animal, right? Okay? A beetle. Wow, jumping right down to it. So let's look at the names we give this thing, okay? So it is an animal, okay? We might even call it an arthropod, meaning segmented legs. The class is Insecta, so our name insect comes from that. Coleoptera means sheathed wing, is what we use for all beetles. So if you call it a beetle. Some people might be able to identify it as a ground beetle. And that's kind of where the family name comes in. Anything other than that, you really need an abnormal affection for insects or a PhD or both to really get down to. So those are the genus species name, as far as I know. It might be mistaken, but Wikipedia usually doesn't lie. Okay, so Carlos Linnaeus, his idea was that everything is related somehow. You just keep going up the chain, and eventually some things are related. So let's take another example. And also, it's important to look at where the things diverge to see how closely related they are. Okay, how far up the chain they go. For example, President Bush. Okay, and a chimpanzee. Okay, politics aside, let's just look at how closely these two things are related. Okay, they're both kingdom Animalia. They're both chordates. They're both mammals. They're both primates. This is where the divergence comes, right here at the family level. No, let me see, genus level. Nope, family level. Okay? So, and then you keep going down, and this is Homo sapien, and I'm not going to try to pronounce that. As politics aside, Dave, we're not going to try to isolate people. Okay? That's interesting because we're going to talk about how we define ourselves later. Thanks for the segue, Dave. So everything is related somehow. President Bush and a chimpanzee, they get down to the family level. That's where the divergence comes, right? Let's look at the beetle we saw previously and maybe a mosquito. They are insects, and they come down to the order level, which is primate. So there's more similarity between President Bush and a chimpanzee than a mosquito and a beetle. Okay? Then we look at insects and humans in general. But as we're looking at the divergence of these different things, it's important to remember that everything is compared with something else. We can be compared to plants. We can be compared to insects. The difference in insects between us and insects comes right here at an extremely high level in classification. So there's a lot of divergence between us and insects, President Bush, and a mosquito. Okay. So what motivates us to name things so specifically? That's where we're going. Okay. There's a sense of pride sometimes when we're able to name things really specifically. Like I said, I'm not an expert in entomology by any means, but I do know enough to be annoying. Like when people would ask me, what is this, when we were over in Ghana, I kind of ran through this scenario in my mind all the time. Do I tell them what they want to hear, or do I tell them what it really is? Because I could rattle off the family names of, I could tell you it's a Regiviid, but you'll just look at me like I'm being, I don't know, silly or making things up. I often got that. Even though I knew what it was, they would say, you're just making that up to sound smart. We run into this quite often, though. Think about the last time you went to the doctor. Did he tell you exactly what you had? Did he tell you you had some sort of melanoma or whatever your problem was? Or did he say, you've got skin cancer, which is a less precise, less exact way to describe whatever you have? Now, it's not necessarily wrong. It's just less exact. And is the doctor dumbing down for you what information he's giving to you? Not really. He's just meeting you at your level. He's meeting you at the common understanding. So, are you less intelligent than the doctor? No, I don't think so. Less educated, maybe. Do you have less intrinsic value because you don't know the specific names of things? I don't think so. You're just less specific in what you've studied or what you understand. So let's take this discussion and cross cultural lines. Let's go to Ghana, where I did my field research. It's important to note that as we cross cultures, the Linnaean idea of binomial nomenclature and the obsession with specifically naming things doesn't apply. That's important to remember. The idea that everything has or even needs a specific name doesn't apply. Here's an example of a problem that I ran into in my first summer of research. I went to Ghana to learn about the medicinal uses of insects, find out why and when they were used in combination with herbs, to try to figure out what the social implications or, why they were using these insects. And as I was going through the process of interviewing, the first 3, 4, maybe even 5 weeks, I was getting really, really odd answers to my questions. I would ask, which insects do you use in your healing? And I would hear grasshopper. I would hear centipede. I would hear snake. I would hear frog. And I kept getting frustrated by, there'd be a couple insects, a couple of, arachnids or random small vertebrates mixed into this idea of what insects do you use. It was really frustrating because I didn't care about anything besides the insects that I was looking for. One funny experience, I was sitting there with 4 or 5 other students, and we were interviewing this traditional healer, and I asked her, what insect is most important to you in your life? And her answer was the chicken. And all the students laughed, and I just kind of shook my head in frustration because obviously a chicken is not an insect in the way that we understand it. So where was I going wrong? Was it the translation? Were they not understanding my questions appropriately? Was I looking for something that didn't exist in this cultural paradigm? Like everyone who studies politics, my answer is a good, strong maybe. The idea that an insect is a 6-legged, 4-winged, 3 body segment animal really doesn't apply in that level of specificity, at least in Ghana where I did my research. I was told that as I probed more into what words were they using to describe, to ask my questions through the translators, I was told repeatedly that insect, the word doesn't exist in Twi, the local language. Does that mean that the concept of an insect doesn't exist, that everything is all mushed together in the same bundle? Not really. They use the word pest, which incorporates anything that has a pesky demeanor. So mosquitoes and flies and chickens and frogs, all of these things are pests, and they're all lumped together in the same idea. Now, there are certain insects that have a certain level of importance in the culture that do have specific names. For example, there's a symbol of fertility, the aboaba, which is a mango weevil, that it has a specific name, a specific position and function in society. And so there are specific names for specific insects, but there wasn't the class like we see it. Ready, go. I had a lot of my collection was done with children because they were usually the most friendly to someone who didn't speak the language, and it's always a good idea to, I don't know, be friends with the kids, or else they throw rocks at you and stuff like that. So in a way that is completely foreign to our paradigm and our way of thinking, the idea that insect doesn't mean what we think it means. When you cross cultures, things get a little more fuzzy, especially when you cross a culture that doesn't have a Linnaean idea of naming things. Here's another example. I was sitting in the courtyard of the place that we were staying, and a good friend of mine named Doris was eating. She had a bowl with some traditional food and some soup and some stew, and she was enjoying herself. And for various reasons, I become a vegetarian when I go over to Ghana. So I was looking at her meal, and I asked, Doris, what are you eating? And she kind of looked at me, and she said, meat. And I was kind of in a critical mood that day, and I was like, are you sure? I was like, what's that right there? And she said, it's meat. She said, Ty, I'm eating meat. Why are you bothering me? And I was like, okay, I'm going to get to the bottom of this meat issue. So I went and I looked in her bowl. I said, what's that? And I pointed at this piece of fat and skin and gristle, and she said, it's meat. And I pointed at the bone with a piece of, I don't know, hanging off of it. And I said, what's that? And she said, it's meat. And I pointed at the goat ear that was floating in the soup, and I said, what's that? She said, it's meat. She said, it's all meat, it's all food. And I thought, that's interesting. Think about what you mean when I say the word meat, what you think of. Do you think of like a T-bone, maybe like a filet mignon, maybe a hamburger? If you're really flexible with your definition, maybe sausage or hot dog or something. But I don't think of a goat ear generally when I think of meat. And is that because we have a too specific view of what meat means? Maybe. So this leads to the second question. Is there an implicit lack of intelligence or sophistication in cultures that don't have specific names for things? Most of us would probably say no, there's no lack of intelligence. So let's ask it a different way. Do you feel smarter when you know the exact name of things? And let's rephrase it one more time. Do you feel that a society or culture that lacks specific names for things, like insects or meat, are they less sophisticated? Are they less advanced? Are they less cultured? Are they less capable of describing their surroundings? Are they quaint? Are they primitive? Now, I do see value in naming things specifically. I worked for over a year in the Bean Life Science Museum in the insects collection, and the major thrust of the research that's done over there is taxonomic identification and systemics and finding out what's related to what and organizing them. However, this type of specific, detailed categorization of life and the obsession for it doesn't come without problems. In the 1880s, taxonomy and systemics was really at its height. It was almost at a feverish pitch with scientists going all over the world, looking at things and trying to decide what's related to what. Darwin's a good example of this. And eventually some scientists started to look at other people and try to analyze and qualify and quantify the differences we see in each other. They started casting this scientific method upon their brothers. Much of the natural world's physical differences indicate speciation to some degree. But that's not necessarily the case with human beings, with Homo sapiens, to be exact. During this time, colonization was really in full swing, kind of on its downward swing, but there was a strong idea of a social hierarchy where the white European male was at the height and everyone else was a devolution of that man to some degree. There's a fascinating book called The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould, who's a biological philosopher, and he looks at some of the early scientific research that went into justifying some of these ideas, and he goes through and debunks some of the actual scientific processes that they went through. But during this time, foreheads were measured, and the width of noses, and the pigmentation of skin, and the size of hands, and the size of feet, and the slope of foreheads were all measured and quantified to give justification for the colonial white man is at the top of the food chain, and everyone else is some sort of devolution below that. So can this be traced back directly to Linnaeus and the obsession with naming and categorizing things? I'm not sure, but I do see some similarities between the two. So let's bring this back to our idea, our theme of international cross-cultural research, and how this fixation with labeling and categorizing things may affect our ability to do appropriate, ethical, verifiable cross-cultural research. Do we focus too much on the divergence points with the people that we come in contact with? Do we look at how far up our chain do they diverge from us? Maybe if we're creating a social kingdom, phylum, class system. Are we too worried about how closely we are related and our ideas are related to actually conduct meaningful research? Here at BYU, when you meet somebody, what are the first 5 questions that everybody asks? Where are you from? What's your name? Where are you from? What's your major? Where do you live? When do you graduate? Maybe what ward you're in. But then always they ask, do you know so-and-so? Almost always. So why do we do this? Regardless if we know it or not, we're creating a context in which to place these people in. When new stimuli come into our lives, it's almost an obsession that we have to categorize them and make connections to other things that we already have established in our paradigm. I think Freud used the word catharsis to this idea of organizing things, and he talked about it almost being like a survival mechanism, that there's so much going on in our lives, so much stimuli, that our hard drive may crash if we have all of this information coming at the same time. So we simplify and categorize and group and lump things together to help them be more understood by us. This can be really problematic when we cross cultures. Let's go back to... There you go. Okay. For all intents and purposes, this guy, which is me, has very little in common with this guy. Okay? One is from the United States. One is from Ghana, West Africa. Okay? One is the son, has the heritage, half Canadian, half American. This man is half Ga, half Ashanti. I speak English and Japanese and enough Spanish to order a taco at Beto's. And he speaks Fanti, Ga, Chui, and English. I really like American football and politics and philosophy. This man really likes soccer and Celine Dion. The points of divergence between these two individuals is really profound. On the surface, there are things that are almost too great to overcome to create a meaningful relationship. But this is my brother. Ready, go. This is Augustine Oko Atakofi Black Mall Augustine, or Alute. Okay? And in a way that I don't really understand and can't really explain, we became brothers in every way that I can mean the word, except for that we didn't share a womb. There's a connection that was forged despite differences, because differences were never an issue. We never sat down and talked about all the ways that we're different. We just had meaningful, mutually beneficial experiences. If we had focused on the divergence points, there's no telling where our relationship would be. We probably wouldn't have gotten past the introductions of, hi, what's your name, where are you from, what's your major. So let's think about the ways that we define ourselves. I'll just leave that. So think about the ways that you define yourself. Are you white? Are you black? Are you Hispanic? Are you Latino? Are you Chicano? Are you Mexican? Are you male or female? Are you a college student, a college professor, a faculty member, a staff member? Are you a junior, a senior, fifth-year senior, sixth-year senior, graduating senior? Are you an RM? Are you a preemie? Are you a PhD? Are you a PhD candidate? Are you a PhD applicant? Are you a Christian? Are you a Catholic? Are you a Mormon? Are you a Jew? Are you an atheist? Are you agnostic? Are you an antichrist? Do you like skiing? If so, do you like cross-country skiing or downhill skiing? Do you like snowboarding? Are you a goofy foot? Are you a social liberal, a social democrat, a socialite? Are you a compassionate conservative, compassionate service chairperson, a libertarian? Are you a librarian? Think about all the different ways you can use to describe yourself, to put parameters on who you are, on what your interests are. The ways that we explain ourselves and introduce ourselves are fascinating. The way that we perceive our in-groups are profound in a lot of ways. But does it really define who we are? Do the parameters we place ourselves and around our hobbies and our interests and our roles in society, do they really shed light on the people that we are, on our inner selves, on our inner divine potential? And if these things so poorly define ourselves, why do we persist in using them to define other people? It's been said that you cannot understand a person until you breathe the same air as they do. I think that statement might be a little bit deeper than we first give it credit for. It may entail more than being in the same place as another person and sharing a meal or sharing a food, sharing a language or a culture. It may mean sharing a deep laugh or maybe a deep cry. Maybe it means being so intimately connected with another human brother that you share the same breath of life, the same position in time and space and spirituality, that maybe at a certain point your infinite and their infinite bisect, and at that point you truly are one. You're taking the same single breath of existence. In cross-cultural research, regardless of whether you have to cross a sea to do it, framing issues and philosophies may be helpful, but I ask you, don't try to frame people as much as we do. Don't place them in a box with presupposed understandings about what they are and what it means to be them. Try to connect with people on a fundamental, basic human way. Connect with them as Homo sapiens, because you are a Homo sapien. Thank you.
We'll go ahead and open it up for questions now. We have about 10 to 15 minutes that we can do that for. We are recording this for the web, so if you would please speak into the microphone, I'll pass this around for those of you who have questions.
I'm interested in your journey. Like, at what point, Tyler, did you begin to think about this labeling? In other words, this cross-cultural awareness and this idea of creating categories and this thing that we've probably all become so used to it we don't even know that we're doing it. When was it that you started recognizing that and having some of these conclusions and thoughts that you've delivered today?
I actually looked back in my field journal to see if I could find where I first started writing ideas about this, and it was about 4 weeks into this past summer, so my second time in Ghana. And it really came after this conversation with Doris, that meat wasn't meat in the way that I understood meat to be. And then with that kind of new perspective on what I was experiencing, I was able to go back and look and see, maybe this is the root of some of the frustrations that I've had and some of the problems that I don't understand are really problems or issues at all. And then it was, I don't know, a couple weeks into this past summer that I really started concretely analyzing what I was encountering.
So your first time to Ghana?
The first time looking back, I ran into the same problems, but I hadn't. I don't know if it was time back in America and then traveling again that really allowed me to look at these issues, these, I don't know, contradictions almost. But yeah, it was my second time.
Tyler, I'm curious about your discovery and thoughts about the way different cultures may frame or categorize the world, and then how that affected your initial research that first summer. Having come to that discovery, did that make you reanalyze the kinds of information you had gathered for your initial research project?
Yeah, completely. My first summer, I was really focused on getting the answers to the questions that I had gone there to answer. And I wrote a paper and presented a presentation at the Entomological Society of America conference, and thought my conclusions were really, really good. And then this past summer, I went and re-interviewed some of the same people and got completely different answers to some of the exact same questions from the exact same people. And it was extremely frustrating because I thought that I kind of had this stuff nailed down and I was going to build upon it. But as I was looking at the answers they gave me in one field journal and the next field journal, I could see that they were saying the same things. I was just interpreting them differently. The first summer I was trying to take their information and work it into my paradigm, into my way of understanding what an insect is and what mystical powers can be drawn from it. And the second one, as I was realizing these problems, I was able to kind of cast aside my paradigm and really try to incorporate the information into a paradigm by itself, separate from mine. So.
I've thought about this issue of labeling and categorizing and the function that it has in our lives, both in our own culture and in others. And I wonder, because I agree with you, I agree that it's kind of a survival mechanism, that we have so much information that we kind of need to do that to be able to to process things and live. But would you say that? I guess with what you're saying, are advocating that we kind of like limit those categorizations as much as possible, or try and make them fluid? Because it's hard for me not to, and I think it's hard for a lot of people not to categorize things, because otherwise, like, how can you understand and process them? We have to have paradigms,
right,
to be able to exist.
You can't exist without a paradigm of some sort.
Yeah,
I think that what kind of my point in I don't know, the conclusion that I've come to, or the point that I would advocate, is to be not necessarily to throw away the context, because it is important to understand people generally before you can understand, or maybe at the same time you're trying to understand people specifically. But maybe just to be more aware of the fact that you're doing it. That when you are asking those questions of where you live, where you come from, that you are placing them into a category. And I think with recognition comes the ability to transcend those kind of paradigm restrictive ideas.
Yeah, just a quick comment and a question. I with the idea of us having this obsession, if you will, to categorize and label people, I've often thought that it might be attributed to we're fearful, we're scared because we can't predict, and by labeling people and labeling things, then they fall into patterns that allow us then to predict, which is really important for us because, if a young woman comes up and talks to you, she may be wanting to identify whether or not you're married or not married because she can relax or know how to predict what your behavior is going to be if she can categorize you as married or unmarried. Mm-hmm. And so I think that has something to do with it, but I've got to think a lot more about it because I do have this theory that we're all scared constantly and very nervous, particularly in social situations. So we have to label somebody as bipolar or something. We have to find some reason to explain behavior, and if we can't find it, then we come up with a psychological term that categorizes them as bipolar or anxiety or obsessive compulsive or something like that. But okay, my question though is, when you got the chicken as an insect, I'm imagining that you just said, well, forget that. I can't. I'm here to study insects, my categories, and chicken doesn't fall in my categories, so forget that. Is that what you did?
Yeah, pretty much.
You didn't explore the medicinal use of chickens.
No, at that point I was so frustrated that I closed my book and put it in my bag, and it was a done deal. I didn't want to talk about chickens.
Would you do it different now? I mean, would that be interesting to? Even though you're to a Western reader, to a Western audience, going to be presenting the research and that, but to explore. I mean, if the native classification system includes a chicken as an insect, then if you're there to understand their culture, then why persist in our categories? Would you be willing to, depart from Brother Linnaeus and dive into and accept the local classification?
Yeah, and as I was relating this experience to my Ghanaian friends a few weeks after the experience, they weren't as shocked by it as I was. I thought, listen to this old lady, she said an insect is a chicken, or chicken is an insect. And actually I talked to a very well-educated Ghanaian, and he said, well, the idea of an insect and is a little bit different here, and he started to relate, and I never got outside confirmation of this. This is anecdotal, but he said that the movement and motion of a chicken is similar to a butterfly or a moth. So functionally, visually, they could be related for all intents and purposes. So, and kind of commenting on your first comment, I think categorizing things and placing them within context within our own culture often keeps us safe. There are social norms that, if violated, indicate maybe mental instability or other things that could be problematic for you, your personal well-being. But I just want to be clear that when we cross cultures and we start placing people as deviant compared to our paradigm, that's when we're really starting to get into trouble.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to sort of laugh and say a chicken is obviously not an insect, but then you bring up the criteria of flapping one's wings, and that's a pretty solid criteria. I mean, Linnaeus didn't buy into it, but it is a criterion. There can be other criteria. So a chicken and a dog definitely wouldn't be related since the dog doesn't flap its wings.
Right.
But other things that do could be related. And
Yeah.
I just think doing the cross-cultural thing, maybe we're going to have to give up some things and look differently at life in order to truly do cross-cultural research.
Right.
Instead of constantly bringing it back to our audiences and our audiences' paradigms.
Right. And just so we don't think that Linnaeus had it all right, the musk ox, are you familiar with that? That looks like it's in the Arctic, big, hairy, shaggy-looking thing. It's called an ox because they figured it was related to ox and
But it's
buffalo
really a
maybe.
fish.
It's really more closely related to a sheep. So it's not even an ox at all. It's a musk sheep. So there are limitations. All right.
One last question.
Okay.
Among biologists, we are always trying to classify things and put them in categories. And the categories that we create are real. There are differences between one group of animals and another group, or between plants and fungi or whatever. And I think there are probably also some real differences among cultures that are real and different. And I'm sure you saw those. In the biological world, we not only try to classify things, but we also look at relationships among things. And we look at how does one species affect another. They may not be related to each other, to the two species, but they certainly interact. And sometimes that's a detrimental relationship, what one eats another, and it's not good for the thing that gets eaten.
Right.
But we also sometimes talk about mutualistic relationships where both organisms benefit. And in many instances, one cannot do without the other, and the other cannot do without the first. For instance, an insect may feed on the floral parts of a flower, get its nourishment from the nectar there, and it survives because of the flower. But the plant cannot survive without the insect there to pollinate. And my question is, are there similar interactions among cultures, and specifically, if there are such things, can you give us some examples of beneficial relationships between you and the Ashanti people?
Okay. Yeah, I think for sure, especially as two cultures interact with each other, there should be a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship between a mutually growing relationship. I'm trying to think of a specific example. There's this woman named Mama Ya, and she's kind of the surrogate mother of two nephews because of the family. The biological mothers had passed away, and there's this kinship responsibility to take care of the children in the family. And she was kind of a surrogate mother, but really kind of lonely. Had some responsibilities around the house, but didn't. I don't know. Most of her interaction came with these young children. So I a couple of times went out and put on old clothes and grabbed a machete and went out and worked with her in her farm. And it was beneficial to me because I learned some language on the way. I was able to see parts of the village that I hadn't been exposed to before. And so I felt it was very beneficial for me. And then on the other side, the reciprocal relationship with Mama Ya that was forged was, I don't know, it was also one of these profound relationships where we were just connected. She called me her son from then on. She treated me like a son. She would tell me my clothes were dirty. She would fix food for me. And I don't want me to come off like I have some I don't know, grand influence on the life of this wonderful woman, but there was, I don't know, it was mutually beneficial in that regard. And I think that those kind of relationships are almost impossible when you go in with a preconceived notion of what this person is. When you already have them in their little box, she's a widow, she's poor, she's a shanti, and maybe you label her as she's African, she's black, she's traditional, all these other things. That if you don't go in there with those preconceived boxes around the people, it's much easier to have those kind of relationships that you're talking about, Dr. Clark. So, thank you.